Alright, hello everybody, welcome back to Public Policy. I hope everyone is staying comfortable and safe during quarantine. Today we're going to talk about education, but first I want to address some questions, or really just two questions we got last time about labor. So last time, remember, we talked about supply and demand for labor, we talked about monopoly, monopsony, and we talked about immigration. Okay, so the first question the student asked from last time was, couldn't a monopsonist really easily price discriminate? Alright, so if you remember our monopsony model, we had an upward sloping labor supply curve and then a marginal cost curve that sloped above it. Alright, because we can't pay one worker more without paying all of our workers more, assuming we're a single price monopsonist. And what that's going to do is that's going to lower the wage we pay, and it's going to restrict the number of workers that we hire. Alright, what one student asked, very perceptively, is, recalling we talked about price discrimination in the monopoly literature, and one important precondition for price discrimination is that we're not able to resell the good, and there doesn't seem to be a way for buyers to, or for workers to sell their labor to other workers, and then those workers can sell their labor to the firm. So it seems like what firms should be able to do is something like this. Okay, where we pay every worker their minimum willingness to accept, their exact opportunity cost for working. We pay every single worker a different wage, and what that's going to do, just like with price discrimination, this wage discrimination is going to increase our output relative to being a single price monopsonist, and it's going to completely wipe out all producer surplus in this case. So remember, in price discrimination, all the consumer surplus gets eliminated. In wage discrimination, all the producer surplus gets eliminated. Alright, so we're going to be paying people the just absolute minimum amount that it takes to induce them to work instead of staying home. I've said in the past that this is kind of Karl Marx's view of how wages work, right? Everyone gets paid just the bare minimum that's required to not starve. That'll get you out of the house, and in return, workers basically get none of the fruits of their labor. Okay. So do we see this in real life? Actually, probably not. So for one, we talked about in class, there aren't, monopsony power isn't quite as widespread, as it might initially appear. They're just looking out the window, there are lots of employers, and people seem to be willing to change jobs because of higher wages. I can go into this more, but in general, wages seem to be determined by workers' marginal product. One thing you can do is you can see, well, what happens to firm output when a worker dies unexpectedly? Right? There was a great dissertation from the University of Pennsylvania that used this method, right? Because if a worker is being paid, this wage here, like way below their marginal product, that if they die, firm output should drop by way more than the worker's wage was. In reality, we don't see that. The consensus seems to be that workers are paid, 80-90% of their marginal product, which is pretty high. Okay, but more importantly, let's say they're even if there are monopsonies, why wouldn't they? Why would they be single price monopsonies? rather than wage discriminating monopsonies, because obviously a wage discriminating monopsonist is going to have a lot more consumer surplus than the single price monopsony. And the answer is that there are lots of negative effects on worker morale and productivity when workers find out that they're being paid different wages than everyone else. So this is a literature review published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is the top economics journal. I'll post this link in the description if you're interested, but just in general, if workers find out that people doing the same job are being paid less, their productivity goes way down and their attendance goes down too. This doesn't have the effect when higher paid peers are paying for being clearly more productive, but remember here, wage discrimination isn't based on productivity, it's based on willingness to accept. Okay, so in theory, a monopsonist could wage discriminate, but we probably don't see that much because, one, there's competition, and two, even if you did have a monopsony, discriminating in wages has negative side effects for worker morale. All right, so that was the question on wage discrimination. Very perceptive. That's a topic that labor economists write on, and we didn't even talk about it. You picked up on that, so good job on you for asking that question. All right, the second thing was someone asked for clarification about a topic we talked about, which was money illusion. Okay, they said, why would work... So if you recall, money illusion is the phenomenon in which workers tend to care more about their nominal wage, the actual number on their paycheck, more than they do the real wage, the actual purchasing power. So if inflation is 5% and workers only get a 3% raise, that's the same as a 2% real wage cut, but workers don't get that upset if you do that. Whereas if you cut if inflation is 0% and you cut someone's nominal wage by 2%, they get really upset, when in reality they're just as they're made just as worse off by the nominal wage cut as they are by the real wage cut. Okay, and that's kind of strange. The person asking the question who asked, why wouldn't workers care more about real purchasing power? And I know that when I was when I was an undergrad and I first found out about money illusion, I was really surprised too, because it seems irrational. But it is very documented. So here's another paper. This is from the 90s, but it's still cited today, where they did a bunch of surveys on money illusion. So they would just ask people, they would give people two scenarios, like, I don't know, I won't write it out, but, inflation's 5%, you get a 3% 3% raise, how unfair is this, versus inflation 0%, your pay gets cut by 2%, how do you feel? And they find very strong evidence of money illusion, okay? When we talk about behavioral economics in a few weeks, we'll talk about something called loss aversion. All right, loss aversion. And what loss aversion means is that, not getting $2 is preferable to getting $2 and then having $2 taken away. Okay, so you can see that these are basically the same transaction, right? At the end of the day, you're just no better off than you were before, right? Here, your net wealth has changed by $0. Here, your net wealth has changed by $0. But what we'll see in experiments, and we'll play a little game when we do behavioral economics. I'm thinking about how to do that over the internet. I might do a live lecture so you guys can play and maybe win some money when we do behavioral econ. But there's a lot of evidence for the fact that people really don't like having things taken away from them. But they're not as upset when they just don't get things in the first place. So, loss aversion is a behavioral psychological quirk that might explain why people care more about their nominal wage than they do about the real purchasing power of their wages. Okay, so I'll link this paper in the description too. All right, with that out of the way, thank you for your questions. It was nice to get a question or two questions. But please ask more. If I get more questions this week, I'll probably make a separate video rather than just addressing them at the beginning. Okay, but let's move into this week's topic, which is education. Alright, so let's just start with some basic facts about education. So, in general, people with higher levels of education tend to earn higher wages. Okay, so high school graduates earn $10,000 more than high school dropouts. Bachelor's degree holders earn $30,000 more than high school graduates. Master's degree holders earn $20,000 more than bachelor's degree holders. You should all think this is good news because you're currently working on getting a bachelor's degree. So it's good to know that it pays off. So thinking about not last week, but 2 weeks ago when we talked about empirics and policy analysis in the real world, should we look at this data and say that going to college raises your wages by 73%? Okay, so think about it. Is that a good conclusion to make from this data? All right. And the answer is probably no, right? Because the people who earn who achieve higher levels of education, the people who don't, are different in ways besides their education, right? So if we really wanted to find out what the effect of education would be, we'd need some kind of randomized trial, okay? We'd have to pick some people to randomly get, a full ride scholarship and other people not to, and we would see how their wages would compare. But in real life, we let people decide how much education they get. Okay, so if I were to take some of you and prevent you from getting your bachelor's degree, just choosing to go to college is already associated with certain characteristics, right? You're probably more conscientious, more intelligent, and all that means is if you were to, for some reason, have to drop out of high school, you would probably earn wages that were above that of the average high school graduate or average high school dropout, right? Because people who drop out of high school are also, less motivated, less intelligent, stuff like that, on average. Okay, so it's really difficult actually to observe what the payoff to education is because we have this endogeneity problem. So you remember we learned about that term when we talked about empirics 2 weeks ago. Okay, so whenever I talk about education with non-economists, typically the first question they ask is, why is college so expensive? All right, maybe you've thought about that yourself and your career as an undergraduate, but I want to pose a different question, and that's, why is college so cheap? That might sound kind of ridiculous because a lot of people pay a lot of money for college, but let's think about an example. Okay, so the average high school graduate earns $40,000. Average bachelor degree holder earns $70,000 per year. So on average, your college degree gives you about $30,000 extra per year. All right, we're gonna cut that in half to account for this ability bias thing. So that's kind of ability bias probably isn't that high. There are even some economists who say it doesn't exist, that this is actually all due to education, but we're trying to be as conservative as possible here. So let's cut that 30,000 in half, well, can't talk, and say that just going to college causally increases your earnings by $15,000. Okay, so if you work for 40 years, that means that your education is getting you, over the course of your entire life, $600,000. Okay, because you're working for 40 years, you're getting an extra $15,000 a year. 15 times 40, $600,000. Okay, so then I looked up what the average cost of college was, and over 4 years it costs you about $80,000 on average to get a bachelor's degree. Okay, so you're paying $80,000 and you're rewarded with $600,000. All right, so education seems like a free lunch. Okay, seems like you're paying relative to what education gets you. Seems like you're paying a very paltry amount. All right, so is this an accurate? Take that economics, right? There are free lunches. Okay, so think about this. Is this an accurate way to view the payoff to education? All right. So obviously not. Okay, there are a few wrinkles. All right. Wrinkle number one is discounting. Okay, so we talked about in the climate change lecture how when you have a benefit or a cost in the future, you need to discount it because $1,000 in 10 years is not worth the same to a person as $1,000 today. Okay, so you could have put your tuition in an index fund or in the stock market, right? And it would have grown on its own. That's one way to think about discounting. Okay, so if you remember, we have our present discounted value formula. So what we would have to do to find out the actual return to education, we wouldn't just use this $600,000, just multiplying the yearly increase in earnings by the number of years. We'd have to discount each year. So we'd get, $15,000 this year, then we discount $15,000 next year, then we discount $15,000 in 2 years, and so on, all the way up to 40. Okay, so that's already going to be one big cut in the observed payoff to education. All right, so think about, are there any other wrinkles? Of course there are. Number two is that there's an opportunity cost to attending college. All right, so we assumed here, right, that the only thing you have to pay to go to college are, tuition, fees, room and board. Okay, but as any good economist will tell you, those aren't the only costs of going to college. They may not even be the largest costs, right? Because if you're going to go to college and sit in class, right, you're giving up the opportunity to do something else. In this case, working, right? So you're giving up 4 years worth of wages at another job, okay? So if discounting makes this number go down, okay, accounting for opportunity cost is going to make this number go up. Okay, so that's wrinkle number two as to why college looks so cheap on paper. Wrinkle number three is completion probability. Okay, so if I go to the store and buy an apple, right, it's pretty much a guarantee that I get to eat the apple. All right, but with education, if I pay for a bachelor's degree, if I pay tuition and room and board, is it guaranteed that I get that bachelor's degree and get the higher wage? Why or why not? Okay, and you're probably thinking, no, it's not guaranteed, for two reasons. One, there's no guarantee that I find a job at the higher wage. Maybe I get a bachelor's degree and then I get really sick or die 2 years into my career, so I don't reap all those benefits. Maybe I get a bachelor's degree in typewriter repair in 1989, and then computers happen. But the more important source of uncertainty to take into account is that it's not even a guarantee that you finish. Okay, so a lot of people start college and end up dropping out because they can't complete the coursework. Okay, so really what you're paying for when you pay tuition is not the guarantee of a bachelor's degree, but it's a certain probability of a bachelor's degree. Okay, because there's no guarantee that you actually finish. So that's going to make the real return to education smaller than it actually appears. Again, that's going to make this $600,000 less. Okay, so that's one thing to think about with education, is that there are going to be 3 wrinkles that are going to make the return to education smaller. I guess 4 if you include the ability bias that we talked about earlier, the fact that people who get high levels of education, people who get low levels of education are different before they ever set foot in a classroom. Okay, so those are 4 wrinkles to keep in mind when you think about the return to education. What's the payoff to going to college? All right, so the next thing, as you remember last week, we talked about labor supply and labor demand. Okay, this is a theory of why people are paid the wages that they are. Labor supply is going to be determined by people's willingness to accept. So this could be how well are other jobs paying. This is the cost disease thing that we talked about. Or how fun is this job compared to other jobs? Remember we talked about compensating differentials. And labor demand is going to be determined by a given worker's marginal value product. Okay, how much money are they going to bring in to the employer for every hour that they're employed? Okay, and where these two functions meet, that's going to be the wage that worker is paid, and then L is the number of workers that the employer is going to hire at that wage. Okay, pretty basic supply and demand. Okay, question for you at home is, how can we incorporate education into this model? All right, so think about that for a second. So we have labor supply and labor demand. We know that education is going to raise people's wages. Okay, so using our model of labor supply and labor demand, how is education going to raise wages? All right, so think about it for a second. And what's going to happen is, in theory, right, is that education is going to make you more productive. Okay, so before you go to college, you can only make, 3 widgets per hour, and then you take a class on widget making, you read books on theories of widgets, you take labs where you practice making widgets, and then you graduate with a bachelor's degree, and now you can make 10 widgets per hour. Okay, and what that's going to do is that's going to shift the labor demand curve to the right. Okay. And that's going to raise the wage that widget makers receive, and it's going to mean more people are employed as widget makers. Okay? So this is our most basic theory of how education raises your wage. All right? And this is called the human capital model of education. All right? And an analogy for how it works is people before they go to college are like this uncut diamond here. Okay, so this is what this is what a diamond looks like when you take it out of the earth. And then you go to college, and your professors and your textbooks, they grind you down and they cut you and they make you more beautiful, and then you fetch a higher price. Okay, this is the human capital model of education. We're actually physically changing the diamond to make it prettier and thus earn a higher wage. Okay. But there are some problems with the human capital model. Okay? So here are two, and students tend to find this really relatable because they've spent a lot of time in school. So puzzle for the human capital model number 1 is we're assuming, that education is actually raising your labor demand. I gave this example of the widget maker, right, who's taking classes specifically on how to make widgets. But if you think about what you've learned in school, a lot of the things don't really seem to have anything to do with what you actually do in jobs. Okay, so think about all of the things you've learned in high school. Let's see. American history, English, some math, right? Maybe science. What fraction of things that you learned in high school actually translated into practical job skills? Okay, so how does learning about Shakespeare or the Civil War or the periodic table make you better at any job? Okay, there are very few jobs where knowledge of Shakespeare makes you a more productive worker. Shakespeare professor, writer of history books, stuff like that. Okay, so that's one puzzle. Okay, that doesn't mean the human capital model is invalid, right? You don't have to throw it out, but it's something to consider, right? If you really are going to use this as your model of why education increases your wages, You need to answer this first question: why does so much of what we study seem completely useless? I gave the example of high school, but this could apply to your college coursework too. So, even this class, so most people who major in economics don't go on to make policy, right? And even if you are going to make policy, this class has been kind of broad in the number of things that it covers, right? So I would say a very tiny fraction of you will ever make immigration policy, which is what we covered last week, right? But for some reason, going to GMU and getting a stamp on your transcript that a grad student lectured to you about immigration policy for an hour and you understood it and did well on tests somehow makes employers say, yes, that's the kind of worker I want, even if you're not doing immigration policy, right? Even if you're working in the private sector, or making other kinds of policy, or whatever it is you want to do with your economics degree, there's a very small chance that it actually involves any of the things that we're talking about in this class. And even if it does involve some of the things, it's incredibly unlikely that it involves all of them. Okay, really the only job I can think of that would involve all of these would be economics professor. So I guess I got a good deal out of my undergrad. Okay, but you didn't, or you haven't yet, in terms of actual practical job skills. All right. Okay, but more generally, okay, so in this example, you are paying for school because school is boosting your human capital. It's making you more productive. Okay, so if you are paying for something and then you don't receive it, you're typically going to be upset. Okay, so if I say, oh, come, you pay me to give you a pie, and then I send you an email saying, sorry, I will not be delivering the pie, you'd be really upset, right? But when students presumably pay for training, job training, that's what education is in the human capital model, and then you get an email from your professor saying, sorry students, I have to cancel class, very few students say, oh man, I've been cheated, I paid the tuition and I'm not getting the training. Most of the time, most students, myself included, they get excited, they're like, yes! This doesn't really make any sense under the human capital model. Okay, so think about these puzzles. Here's just a little clip.
If you don't learn Roman numerals, you'll never know the date certain motion pictures were copyrighted. Everybody come quick! Something's happened! No time to explain! No, children, no! Your education is important. Roman numerals, etc. Whatever. I tried.
So, Roman numerals are a great example of something that education teaches that in our model raises your productivity as a worker, but in reality doesn't. Okay, so think about this for a little bit. Think about how you would resolve these puzzles. Maybe you think that these skills are actually useful. We'll talk more about that later. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about some other models of how education raises your earnings.